I both love and hate this monitor at the same time. Some things are just really great about it, and it even has some features I've actually never seen before. Like, take a look at the brightness adjustment, for instance. Instead of percentage values from 0 to 100, we actually can adjust the brightness directly in nits, which I think is pretty neat. And there are a lot of other small and also bigger things about this monitor that are really great, but then there are things like this directional toggle, which feels and sounds so cheap when touching it that I would criticize it even if this was a $200 monitor. But this is not a cheap monitor, and this is just one example of the many small things that are somewhat annoying about the AG274QG, which apart from that is an excellent monitor. Now, before going into much detail, here is a little disclaimer. AOC sent this monitor for the purpose of this review, but of course they don't get any input on this review whatsoever. That being out of the way, let's have a quick look at the most important specs. This is a 27-inch 1440p monitor with a 240Hz IPS panel. Now, I wasted the better half of a day trying to get access to the factory menu, attempting to find out which panel AOC actually used, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find the right button combination. But my educated guess is that this is the same nano IPS panel we already know from the Alienware AW2721D. The first hint is the unusual shape of the subpixels. Both monitors have chevron-shaped pixels, so essentially pixels that look a bit like Cs or rotated Vs instead of our usual straight pixels. This is not very common, and in combination with the identical specs, that's a pretty good indication that this is the same panel. And there are other signs that the AG274QG uses exactly the same panel, which is the LG Display LM27QB Edge, by the way. The contrast ratio, for instance, is very similar as well to what I've measured with the Alienware. 1030:1 is pretty much average for an IPS panel, but considering that this likely is one of LG's nano IPS panels, that's a pretty solid result actually. Now, to increase the perceived contrast, we also get the option to enable local dimming separately for both HDR and the SDR mode, which is a neat feature. Though the local dimming is by no means perfect, as we're talking about an edge-lit backlight here. I counted a mere 32 horizontal dimming zones, so as we'd expect, there's a lot of blooming visible with these test pictures. For less extreme scenarios like watching regular movies or videos, I still think the local dimming feature adds some value. Pretty much the same is true for the HDR mode of this monitor. It's far from being perfect, but it adds some value. For starters, it actually gets pretty bright. With a 10% window, it scratches on the 700 nits mark, which is a very respectable result. Still, the not so great contrast ratio and the lackluster 32 dimming zones are what's holding the AOC back from delivering a really good HDR experience, but I have to say that it exceeds the threshold of good enough that enabling HDR actually adds some value. Even outside of the HDR mode, the AG274QG still provides a pretty high maximum brightness. And the lowest brightness setting goes down to just 42 nits, which I definitely appreciate. Now, it's pretty unique that we actually can go into the menu and set the brightness to 40 nits instead of 0%. In return, a setting of 40 nits actually gives us a measured 42 nits. And despite the small deviation, that's almost the same brightness value we've set it to. And that's very consistent across the brightness range, so this actually works. I think the brightness adjustment in nits really is a great feature, and that's something I'd really like to see from other monitors as well. A caveat though is that the brightness adjustment of this monitor is not compatible with third-party control software like Click Monitor DDC, for instance. And AOC's own control software unfortunately is extremely sluggish and sometimes even straight up doesn't work at all. We really are forced to using the joystick on the back of the monitor for changing the brightness and anything else, which really is a shame, especially because this might be the cheapest and most flimsy directional toggle I've ever seen on a monitor. Now, AOC also include a little remote that we can use instead, which is a neat idea, at least in theory. For starters, this remote is connected with a wire, which is way too long, so you have to figure out for yourself where to hide that cable mess. And then for some strange reason, the remote doesn't allow to press and hold buttons for changing settings quickly. So as you probably can imagine, changing the brightness from the lowest setting of 40 to the highest setting, which is 450, takes a while when you literally have to click that arrow button over 400 times. So I tried using the integrated light sensor and let that adjust the brightness for me, but as many of these, it doesn't really do a great job. So I guess we're more or less forced to using that wobbly directional toggle. And as you might have already noticed, not only the joystick, but actually the whole monitor is somewhat wobbly. Given how big and sturdy that stand is, I surely wouldn't have expected that. Now recently it seems to be a bit of a trend that monitor stands are getting bigger and bigger, and for the AG274QG you really need a big desk, as it measures about 35 centimeters back to front. Also the stand extends quite a bit to either side, potentially getting in the way of your mouse. Not a big fan of that. Though that stand does offer all kinds of ergonomic adjustments anyone could ask for, including height, tilt, swivel and pivot. Rotating the display is only possible clockwise, which I think is a good thing. Now when it comes to image quality, I'm very pleased with what this monitor has to offer. For starters, colors look vibrant and saturated, because, well, this is a wide gamut monitor. But it's also fairly color accurate out of the box. Only the white point is a bit off, but once we've corrected that, we get very good results. Though, as we'd expect, the average delta E still is too high, because this is a wide gamut monitor and we're testing against the sRGB color space. But this monitor still has a trick up its sleeve, and AOC actually did something really smart here. Instead of making a dedicated sRGB mode that changes and blocks a bunch of settings, they've implemented a simple toggle option to enable or disable the sRGB clamp, which is unaffected by other settings. Honestly, I really don't get why other monitors don't do it that way. It's so much better than having a dedicated sRGB mode. It doesn't change or block any settings, it just does what it's supposed to do, which is clamping the color gamut to sRGB if you wanted to. And it really does a great job doing so. That's pretty much professional level accuracy and definitely good enough for more serious photo or video editing. This won't really get much better when we calibrate and profile the monitor ourselves instead. Now these are the settings I recommend using, and as always you can download the ICC profile from the description down below. This is meant to be used in conjunction with these settings and with the sRGB clamp being turned off. In case you don't know how to use an ICC profile, I've got a guide linked in the top right corner. Now, this monitor has a G-Sync module and the G-Sync Ultimate certification, so we would expect nothing less than a perfect G-Sync performance. And that's exactly what we're getting. I haven't noticed a single flaw, flickering or any other issues. It also comes with the NVIDIA Reflex Latency Analyzer built in. This measures the in-game delay caused by the PC and monitor. With that information we can adjust our game and PC settings to potentially reduce the latency of our system. If you're using a compatible mouse, like I'm doing here, this tool will also show the total mouse click to photon latency, which is also nice to know. It's surely not something you're gonna use every day, but once or twice to tweak some settings, this actually is pretty nice. I measured about 30 milliseconds of PC plus display latency for Valorant here, in case you wanted to know. Now, I'm very happy with the overall gaming performance of this monitor. It's responsive and also fast. To have a closer look at how fast it actually is, we're gonna use Blurbuster's pursuit camera technique. AOC provides us with 3 different overdrive modes in addition to the overdrive off setting. The panel's native response times performance in the overdrive off setting is actually pretty good already, but the weak mode improves that even further. If we look closely, the overdrive is really tuned to the edge in the weak setting, as we can already see some faint overshoot in the middle and light track. It's still very usable and the faint inverse ghosting isn't really noticeable most of the time. The medium setting though is too strong already, as it shows quite a bit of inverse ghosting. Unsurprisingly, the strong mode is even worse. So the weak overdrive setting is the best mode here at 240 Hz. And it's also usable throughout the refresh rate range, which is always nice to see. 120 Hz though is a bit of a weak spot for this mode, no pun intended. It surely looks decent, but if you're constantly using refresh rates close to 120 Hz, you might want to set the overdrive to off instead. Otherwise, like for adaptive sync gaming, I prefer just sticking with the weak overdrive setting. And here, for the first time ever, actual response time numbers. Now some things about my testing methodology and representation might change in the future, but here's a first glimpse at my very own response time measurements. Big shout out to Tech Team GB for making this a whole lot easier with their OSR TT device and software. Now back to the UFOs. To put the performance of the AOC into perspective, here's what the Alienware AW274QG looks like in its best mode. As I said, I believe they both use the same panel. Alienware though was a bit more conservative when tuning the overdrive, so we get slightly less inverse ghosting in the middle and light track, which I slightly prefer over the more aggressive tuning of the AG274QG. Both of these monitors perform extremely well though. Here's what one of the fastest VA panel monitors looks like in comparison. And this is one of the fastest TN panel monitors on the market, which actually is one of the fastest monitors in existence. And I think both the AOC and Alienware actually don't look too bad in comparison. Or in other words, these two are very good gaming monitors. And one thing that drives me crazy about the AG274QG is a high-pitched noise that's coming out of the back of the monitor. I'm not entirely sure whether that's coil whine or fan noise, but it's there and it's annoying. For some strange reason, it's only audible when the brightness is under about 250 nits and basically non-existent for anything brighter. This makes me think that noise has something to do with the internal fan. Not sure whether this is a general issue or only if my unit is affected, but that's certainly something to keep in mind. By the way, I didn't notice any noise with the Alienware AW274QG. Now, as I said in the beginning, I'm in a bit of a love and hate relationship with this monitor. Small things like the high-pitched noise, the useless remote and wobbly direction toggle drive me crazy. But on the other hand, this is a very good gaming monitor, and it also is very color accurate after only a few tweaks. But that's also true for the Alienware AW274QG, which I think uses exactly the same panel. So the question really is whether you should get this or the Alienware instead. Now I can't really tell you if a white or rather a black and red monitor fits your setup better, but there are a few other things that may influence your decision. The AOC has built-in speakers, and these actually are pretty decent, whereas the Alienware has none at all. The Alienware also doesn't have an sRGB mode and no reflex latency analyzer. Apart from these few things, both monitors are extremely similar when it comes to gaming and color accuracy, so you might as well just get the cheaper one if none of these things matter to you. I have both monitors linked down below, and if you wanna have a look at my review of the AW274QG, I have it linked on screen right now. Thanks for watching, man sieht sich im nächsten Video.